Governance of Artificial Intelligence, Week 5, Session 24. This is a course offered by Nassar University of Law in the NPTEL platform. The topic here is Evolution of AI Ecosystem in India, the way forward. This session is based on the available literature or a cross-section of the available literature on the governance of AI for India and then how the India's AI ecosystem should move forward. The literature we have consulted includes the Economic Survey of India and then a lot of other literature which is available in scholarly journal. So we have tried to put them all together and then come up with some ideas and give a overall picture. But then that doesn't mean that this is the full picture available or this represents each and every view expressed in literature on that. So take this as more like a broad overview which is available from the literature on the evolution of AI ecosystem in India. And of course, evolution of AI ecosystem in India is a more like a work in progress, and nobody can say that this is the final word or nobody can say that this is the only path India should take. So the evolution of AI ecosystem in India, the way forward. AI in India's economic context is very important to understand. In 2025, 88% of the surveyed organizations, McKinsey 1993 firms, reported using AI of at least one business function. This is up from 50% in 2022. And then 31% are in the process of scaling AI application across their organizations. 7 have already fully deployed integrated AI. AI usage is concentrated in high income countries but rapidly expanding into middle income countries, 22.5% upper middle, 18.7% lower middle. So the frontier of AI development remains hardly considered a few large firms, capital, compute, data, energy intensive with high entry barriers. But India's IT sector faces a hollowing out risk if adoption lags. That AI threatens to replace low-cost labor arbitrage that underpinned India's comparative advantage in the information technology-enabled services and in the software services sector. AI and labor, the emerging evidence is mixed. The Yale Budget Lab said there is no discernible broad labor market disruption from AI in the US so far. Early evidence is reassuring for labor-abundant economies like India. On the other hand, Bridgen Silfol, Chandar and Chan in 2025 said difference in job prospects between high and lower AI exposure occupations remain minor in the near term. Renaud also pointed out a study that most Danish workplaces benefit from AI adoption, suggesting that complementarity may dominate substitution in the initial stages. However, Box 14.1 analysis of the US Professional Business and Information Services PBIS analysis shows a reduced marginal responsiveness to employment output growth post 2022. The signals a structural shift. AI is not eliminating jobs abruptly, but is decoupling employment growth from output growth, a quiet, steady drift. Structural shifts in the US PBIS sector key findings. ARTL model estimated PBIS non-supervisory employment using wages output, interest rate and then consumer price information. Post December 2022 regime indicator positively associated with PBIS employment, reflecting a structural adjustment to integrate AI, labor reallocation or displacement. Then the interaction term post 2022 versus output is negative, statistically significant marginal responsiveness of employment to output growth has declined. Non-PBIS sector shows near growth long-term coefficient, confirming that structural change is sector specific, not a broad macroeconomic phenomenon. Implication here is unless workers adapt and acquire new skills, the labor intensity of GDP may decline further, posing risks for India's service-led growth model. But then there are huge asymmetries in the global AI ecosystem. Frontier versus application gap. Advanced foundation models training in capital and compute intensive. Few hyperscale firms control the trajectory, standards and pricing. Most countries are remaining as mere users. Scale versus inclusion. AI adoption raises marginal productive capital over labor. Rapid deployment risks displacement faster than economy can reabsorb the workers. Open versus proprietary. Proprietary models are opaque black boxes. Open source models offer lower barriers but require coherent national stewardship to avoid fragmentation. Compute versus resource constraints. Data centers require massive electricity and water. Global AI data centers consume about 56,000 crore liters of water annually, a critical risk for India. That is what some people have flagged. And then the whole question of regulation versus innovation. Compliance costs scale poorly for smaller firms, or they find it very difficult to incur the compliance cost. Over-regulation stifles innovation. Under-regulations creates systemic risks in healthcare, finance, and governance. This we have already seen in the first and week itself, that the problem of pacing problem as well as the problem of over regulation versus under regulation, and then the problem of regulation versus innovation. Then the strategic autonomy and global integration also we have seen in week 3, particularly looking at the global geopolitics, and then the idea of AI sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and then tech sovereignty. So AI has emerged as a geostrategic asset. Export controls on advanced chips, restrictions on technology transfer, weaponization of software inputs create systemic dependency risks. 73% of all data centers by count are located in high-income countries as of June 2025. The data available has been updated, but then the full data, even if we take into account, is more or less the same. India holds only 3% of global data capacity despite generating about 20% global data, but this situation may change within the next 5 years as lot of global data centers are being planned in India, particularly taking into advantage the availability of massive data as well as of the incentives and then the government's policy to promote that global data centers in India. And India currently contributes only 2% of the global startups focused on creative AI training data, a critical gap given data's role as a core production factor. So the complete technological self-sufficiency is neither feasible nor efficient. The challenge is balancing strategic autonomy with continued integration of global innovation networks. So AI should not be treated as yet another technological advancement, but more like a strategic priority with implications for critical infrastructure, labor market, foreign policy, and culture. So what are the bottlenecks to AI compute expansion? The agent model simulated 40 quarters medium-centered data center across 3 sectors. Baseline, high foreign GPU demand, high domestic demand with liberal financing. So the baseline is finance is the initial bottleneck. Easing as revenue accumulates, hardware access becomes dominant, persistent constraint over simulation horizon. The scenario 2, high foreign GPU demand side, elevated GPU prices worsen project economics. Then financial bottleneck presses longer, decoupling between financial readiness and execution capability. The scenario 3 is high domestic demand, liberal finance, financing constraints eases faster but dominant bottleneck decisively shifted to GPU availability, abundant capital is insufficient. So the conclusion is global GPU supply chain concentration is a binding constraints for India's AI infrastructure scale-up. Policy must enhance supply-side resilience alongside demand-side incentives. So the supply-side resilience as well as demand-side incentives should be balanced, as otherwise the global GPU supply chain concentration can become a major binding constraint for India's infrastructure scale-up. But then we should also take into account these studies with a pinch of salt because these are based on simulation and the last 40 quarters. And then the last 40 quarters need not necessarily be the guiding ones for the next 40 or 20 quarters as the investment priorities shift, as companies look for better located data centers where incentives and then other infrastructures are available, and more importantly, as the resistance for data center expansion and then establishment grows in many countries including USA, many of the big firms may look at countries like India as the better option to establish data centers in terms of the availability of land, cheaper labor, incentives, and then other pro-industry policies. India's AI development strategy is a bottom-up case. India's AI is ecosystem sufficiently young that existing imbalances need not define India's trajectory, and opening access to shape a value-creating, dignified employment pathway. So the AI developments will have to be a natural spillover into services, manufacturing, defense, and power. Reliance on foreign multinational create diplomatic vulnerability. It is not just diplomatic vulnerability, but also vulnerability in the long term, particularly in terms of technology. AI should be treated as a strategic priority with far-reaching implications for critical infrastructure, the labor market, foreign policy, and culture. India ranks among the top contributors to global AI research output, possesses a high AI literature workforce, outranked only by US as of 2024, but we should also take into account that some of this data cannot be taken as the ones that will establish the trends of the future, because in the neck to neck competition with US, China is also outpacing US in terms of every indicator. And then the India's heterogeneous domestic data across health, agriculture, finance, education, public administration constitutes an underutilized comparative advantage, or the availability of a heterogeneous domestic data in huge quantity across sectors is an underutilized but competitively significant data advantage for India, particularly when India wants to go for its own AI solutions, building upon its AI frontier models, and then also to utilize these models as well as the data available for tailoring models that are more suited to the global South's needs. Bottom-up AI development. Global AI has diverged. West pursued top-down frontier model with massive capital. India's constraints compute finance infrastructure make a bottom-up approach strategically necessary. Bottom-up approach means distributed innovation across firms and centers, strong state coordination, emphasis on application AI specific than frontier model supremacy. So one proposal has been that proposal AI as an operating system initiative where government as a monetary stakeholder like UPI and other will enable pooled public data sets so that a shared computer infrastructure milieu and open source coordination platforms are available to develop this further. And then application of specific small modules computationally efficient can run on smartphone PCs will reduce the entry barriers and enable innovation from startups, research institutions and public agencies. So open models are rapidly closing performance gap with proprietary models. India is one of the largest open source developer communities is well positioned to leverage this. See, most of the Chinese models that are available are open source models, and then these models also have proven that it is possible to develop frugal AI models without the need for huge computing capacity or without going the way the West has developed top-down frontier models. But the challenge for India will be to translate these options into a coherent AIOS initiative that will bring in the stakeholders together as well as make the pooled data sets available with compute infrastructure and then other enabling policy frameworks. So Southern India, AI-enabled non-invasive thermal EEG tools are available for low resource settings, reducing dependency on expensive infrastructure. In Eastern India, portable AI-assisted oral cancer screening devices have been put to place. In Bengaluru, AI-based real-time water management has been put to use. Himalayan region, machine language-powered landside alert systems are in place. In agriculture, AI-enabled networks improved market access, price discovery and logistics for 1.8 million farmers across 12 states. This is again an AI-enabled framework. The Bharshini of the MITI and then AI for Bharat from IIT Madras enable language and voice first AI, extending digital services to historically excluded populations, enabling native language interaction on low-cost devices. So in frugal AI, India has got a huge advantage, but then to scale that up in terms of credible tested applications that could be scaled up across various countries in various contexts and within India itself, and then also to build continuously models based on frugal AI that are easily deployable for different contexts is a major challenge. But then the real problem here is, one, many of these applications at this stage have not been thoroughly tested across different contexts and have been tested in limited environments. Two, while India AI Coach and then other measures are there to develop a catalog or a commons of all these applications, we do not have a framework or we do not have a specific initiative that will independently assess them, help them in scaling up and then put them in place across various areas or various institutions where they could be tested, fine-tuned and developed further. Then the point number 3 is that while there are initiatives like Bharshini and AI for Bharat, we need more of the similar initiatives across different sectors so that not only scaling up, but a seamless integration of these networks and these applications in different networks is possible across sectors like food, agriculture, health, and more importantly, in sectors where AI can play a real time role. So, the human capital for AI, building the talent pipeline, two skill sets are required: algorithmic understanding and then software engineering. India has got good capability in both. Tacit capabilities are best sourced via diaspora return pathways and university academia lateral entry. So the practitioner fellowships and apprentice models embedded in real production environments are good proposals for this. But the training must begin early, high school or university level in collaboration of industry, and then universities need freedom to curate the courses per industry standards, and then the Vikshit Bharat Shiksha Anushantan Bill 2025 is expected to give clarity on this. So the proposed Earn and Learn initiative, credit-bearing industry fellowships from class 11, academic credits plus paid work experience through apprenticeship across sectors, and then the national education policies, multiple entry exit provisions, academic bank of credits, national credit framework policy are expected to provide the policy infrastructure for operationalizing this vision. So how should we rethink education for AI era in India? AI is outperforming entry-level workers, so waiting till post-graduation for industry experience is no longer viable. Experience building must begin earlier. Primary education must prioritize foundation cognitive, social, emotional skills, literacy, numeracy, reasoning, problem solving as basis for later technical skills. So the VBox, a consultancy firm, came up with India Skills Report 2025, stating that employers place highest weight on the engagement, self-efficacy and working with others, not mere technical or digital literacy. So the sectoral mapping of high-skilled, understaffed positions outside white-collar workspace needed, particularly in nursing, geriatric care, culinary sciences, advanced metal work, early childhood education, and physiotherapy. Or AI may increase demand for experience-intensive roles. The education system must enable experimental learning and adaptability across multiple occupations, across multiple skills, not just credential accumulation. Or credential accumulation should not be a substitute for experiential learning and skill development. So the human value in AI-driven economy, AI is as a powerful ship. Moves faster than any human, but without knowledgeable captain who understand the vessel and the water, it can drift aimlessly. Domain expertise becomes a binding constraint. AI can access vast knowledge but lacks internal sense of context. Cognitive workers must supply deep subject matter understanding. So the continuous reading and knowledge accumulation are core productivity inputs. AI amplifies returns to prior knowledge. Those who read widely steer models far more effectively. Or if you have a prior knowledge, it is easy to develop that further and then accumulate knowledge. At the same time, cognitive workers should work as the system architects, decomposing complex problems, sequencing inequalities, and then imposing constraints and defining evaluation criteria. So skilling strategies must prioritize domain depth, analytical listening, and then structured problem solving so that continuous learning from early age is feasible. So governance, data and institutions, what we have discussed about the AI's governance framework. How do we go about using AI as a strategic resource, and then what is the institutional design that is required for it? The AI governance framework, which we have already discussed, we have also discussed about the proposed AI governance groups and then the technology policy experts, so we need not repeat the same thing again here. The AI Economic Council for India came from the one of the good ideas. AI Economic Council would operate with moral imperatives sensitive to India's socio-economic realities, align technology deployment with education, skilling and resource constraints. Principle 1, human privacy. Principle 2, labor market sensitivity. Principle 3, sequencing over speed. Principle 4, co-evolution of technology and human capital. Principle 5, ethical non-negotiables. So under this, every human AI deployment must demonstrate a credible pathway to net social economic benefits, employment, productivity, public service quality. AI policy must internalize India's labor structure, high informality, skill heterogeneity, regional variation, limited safety nets with ex-ante impact assessments. Sequencing over speed is required where AI adoption should not fall into deploy now, pilot, defer or institutional readiness. Instead, we need skills, legal frameworks and labor adjustment capacity. And then evolution of technology and human capital should be co-evolution should be there. Ethical non-negotiables like strict limits on surveillance misuse, worker monitoring and algorithmic discrimination should be made part of the AI governance. So 100 plus people's data, broadband access, diversity of domestic data, these constitute a comparative advantage, but current governance risk value capture abroad. Current stock of training data to run out, this is a global issue. Models collapse on synthetic data, so firms have to seek freshly human-generated domestic data, raising India's bargaining power in that. So the three core objectives of the framework: preserve openness for cross-border flows. But this again is a very contentious idea because cross-border flows, India is not something that favors a unlimited cross-border flows. Ensure regulatory oversight and enforceability, promote domestic value retention. So building upon DPDP Act of 2023, expand data categorization by sensitivity and economic use, large-scale behavior, transactional, inferred data sets require differentiated heightened treatment. So general purpose model training, large scale monetization or high impact uses. So they need enhanced transparency and then startup research institutions face a lighter compliance. Data governance framework should include accountable portability over rigid localization. Data can cross borders, but entities processing at scale must ensure auditable and traceability, not mandatory domestic processing, but this may not be fully compatible with the idea of data sovereignty as well as the idea of 100% data localization. So the conflict between accountable portability and then full data localization is a real conflict. Mirror data for oversight, eligible entry merge complemented copies with India, regulatory oversight without restricting global pipelines. So incentive compatible value retention. They must contribute via local model training, financial contribution to India R&D, compete sharing or research partnership. This is more like access and benefit sharing, where you get access so that you are able to get data for extracting commercial value, but then you need to come up with a benefit sharing mechanism so that you contribute in return for various purposes like local model training. But the challenge is how to translate this into credible, implementable access benefit sharing mechanisms, particularly when it is very difficult to put a value to the data and also to set up access and benefit sharing mechanisms that are transferable based on legal principles, and more importantly, the mechanisms that will continue to work on a long-term basis. So, extracting commercial value from India data is an activity that can be permitted provided there is a specific regime for access and benefit sharing. But in reality, globally, firms extracting commercial value from data, not just in India but anywhere, are not the ones that favor benefit sharing in different varieties or in different forms. So this is not a problem which India is also facing, but it's a global problem of access and benefit sharing for data, particularly data that is generated in a huge population like India. So the transparency centered AI regulation should focus on data set provenance, standardized model documentation, impact assessment for high-risk deployment, and post-deployment monitoring. So for the state, access is the primary lever, compliance linked with eligibility for government data sets as to who will be able to access under what conditions and whether the national AI missions will guide that. Then you need regulatory sandboxes and public procurement norms so that the incentives are there without expanding statutory controls. So the data governance framework, while building upon the DPDP Act, will also have to look at other constraints and other factors like cross-border data flow, particularly the emerging norms, particularly when India wants to go into free trade agreements with multiple partners, including European Union, USA, and others, particularly where data localization and then cross-border data flow are very sensitive items. So data governance framework, if handled well properly and then with the right principles and implementable mechanisms, can be a core assets in India to not only to derive value from data but also to make the best use of data in the long run. AI governance global comparisons we have already done. Singapore's model AI governance updated in 2020 is voluntary, principle-based, sector-agnostic, regularly updated, AI-verified toolkit against these level ethical principles. Of course, Singapore is one of the pioneering countries when it comes to AI governance. Very recently, they came up with a governance mechanism or governance framework for agentic AI. So, Singapore model AI governance can be taken as a good example of how a country is trying to come up with terms with emerging issues and then emerging practices in AI governance. India's approach is a combination of soft law and hard law, combination of existing laws plus technical tools plus institutional design, leveraging DPI precedent and then risk-based, proportionate, incentive compatible. We have discussed about the guidelines which the of the AI guidelines of India as to how the India's approach to AI governance is anchored on different principles and then how the proposed implementation has been suggested. So the key adaptation for India would be differentiated risk model, lighter for small startups, equity and social impact assessments for high-risk AI, federated governance structure with state-level implementation rules. So India can develop a unique model that is unique for the global south. So here again, key governance mechanisms, model codes, third-party conformity assessment, post-deployment surveillance, UNESCO red teaming for AI for social good playbook that can be adopted, then testing protocols recommended for India like bias reduction, adversarial robustness, scenario simulations, community engagement. Then the telecom engineering fairness assessment rating AI system is a domestic standard. Harmonization with ISO 42001 is recommended for credibility. AI instant reporting system, public registry, transparency reporting requirement similar to social media required for track deployment rates and mitigate adverse effects. See, we have picked up some of these recommendations and then some of these suggestions from the literature. In addition to what the AI governance mechanisms that came out of the deliberations of the committee that was appointed by the committee under the chairmanship of Professor Balram and Ravindranath, IIT Madras. So, in the literature, you will find, in addition to what the committee has recommended or what the government came as the AI governance guidelines, people have come up with their own suggestions and then mechanisms. So, we have tried to give an idea as to how different stakeholders have come up with different ideas on that, so that you will have an idea as to what have been the preferred and suggested one from available in the literature. So the sectoral AI governance priorities which have been suggested in the healthcare are rigorous clinical validation, fairness testing, and then strict data protection. For financial services, algorithmic fairness, systematic risk monitoring, agriculture data privacy for farmers' data, land, yield data, affordability access for some smallholders, respect for traditional knowledge, testing under low collectivity conditions and local languages. In education, what is the role of AI? Is AI a major one or is it going to be a supplementary tool, not a substitute for critical thinking? Monitor cognitive atrophy risk from Gen AI dependency, which the MIT and then Microsoft studies recently have confirmed that continued use of Gen AI or Gen AI dependence may result in deterioration of critical thinking. Of course, this is a contentious area where there is no consensus, but then there is a broad thinking which states that Gen AI dependence in the long run is not good for critical thinking or deployment of Gen AI and then dependence on that may result in some sort of cognitive atrophy as well as in declining of thinking as a skill and thinking as an adaptable skill that could be applied in different contexts. So, while there is no consensus on the role of AI in the broader education, that at what level AI should be put in and why AI should be a complementary or supplementary tool, and then what should be the way AI should be put across different institutions where higher education, for research, for education, teaching and all. There's a need for sectoral AI governance policies. In governance in defense, AI use in public administration carries huge risk. Predictive policing, facial recognition, emotion inference must be restricted or prohibited as non-negotiable ethical barriers. This again we have seen in some of the previous sessions also as to why some applications like facial recognition, predictive policing are hugely controversial, not just in India but also globally, and how different environments, how different countries are trying to come up with solutions for them. So safety and AI risks, we have again come up with that. Some of the guidelines principles we have discussed. Key priority should be transparency in AI safety evaluations like aisafetyclaims.org. Big tech firms obfuscate evaluation methods and provide dubious interpretation of results. So India should be very wary of taking what they say as claims as true. Then AI as synthetic biology risk. This is a huge emerging risk. We will discuss this in one of the upcoming sessions, particularly when we talk of the issues related to AI's convergence with other technologies. So open source CRISPR kits combining with AI models capable of generating genome sequences dramatically lower the bioweapon misuse barrier. This use urgent attention, but the dual use problem in AI plus synthetic biology, as well as AI being done separately, as well as synthetic biology being used for dual use, is a huge upcoming risk. Similarly, the social psychophancy risk, where the AI over-affirm users' action at rates higher than the human benchmarks, increasing dependency while reducing willingness to engage in corrective behavior. Or whether AI would result in addiction to people, addiction to use of AI as a behavior, something which is similar to drug use or alcohol misuse. Will that happen? And will people become more dependent on AI, particularly when AI is now inducing them to become more dependent, or AI is behaving people to reinforce their behavior instead of making them to engage in corrective behavior? Or will we see in social psychophancy people becoming more dependent, overusing of AI and getting addicted to AI in one way or another? Of course, there are no clear-cut evidence beyond many of these risks, but then emerging studies and then proper guidelines will be required as AI gets more widely adopted, particularly among teenagers and also among people who are emotionally more sensitive to overuse of AI. So the Safety Institute has been proposed. It should work with AI Safety Institute, adopt NIST AI risk management frameworks. Whistleblower protection is critical so that insiders who know the potential hazardous and risk applications can really come up with the facts, and the safety institutions should work with governance bodies to protect them. The non-negotiable restrictions like predictive policing, frontier, facial recognition, emotional inference, psychological magnification, classifying individuals by personalities. So, two independent studies confirm AI dependence for creative work and writing stores contribute to cognitive atrophy and deterioration of critical thinking capabilities. So, this again, the AI Safety Institute, whether they should consider this as an emerging risk and then try to bring in AI safety norms for this, is a controversial idea, but AI safety institutions have to broadly work on emerging threats, emerging risks, as well as the potential for emerging models to become major challenges for the evolving norms in AI safety. So the Global AI Summit, first it starts with the November 2023 Bachelor Part 1, where the focus was on existential risk of the AI models. 28 countries signed the declaration. AI Safety Institutes worldwide, with the UK starting its first AI Safety Institute. Seoul was focused more on institutional scaffolding, expert AI Safety Institutes, voluntary frontier AI safety commitment by 16 AI companies. The Paris one broadened the agenda to sustainability, human rights, and inclusivity. 58 countries signed a non-binding summit declaration, but both UK and USA declined because there was a huge disagreement on governance scope. The FUB 2026 AI Impact Summit of New Delhi, first in series hosted by the Global South nations, organized around 3 sutras, People, Planet, Progress, also came up with the AI Summit declaration. So the AI declaration was endorsed by 92 countries, broadest to sign in on the series, including Russia, China, UK, US. But there was no mention of AI safety, pivot to secure and trusted AI. So the outcomes and deliverables, 6 lakhs persons attended, 100 plus countries sent their delegations, 300 plus exhibitors, 200 plus billion AI investments were announced, Reliance 100 billion over 7 years, Adani 100 billion over 2035, TCS OpenAI partnership, Frontier AI commitment, 13 companies committed to publishing anonymized AI usage oversight, strengthening multilingual AI evaluations. So Global AI Commons was proposed, AI Impact repository of impact stories of enabling cross-border learning and South-South knowledge transfer, documenting replicability and adaptability of AI solutions. So a charter for democratic diffusion of AI was endorsed by 25 countries, promoting access to compute, data set, open source models, and resilient AI ecosystem. But this again is a soft law charter, not binding, but more like a wish statement, more like affirming that we are interested and we are committing to this promoting access. So the inclusion debate must move upstream from databases to systems and communities that produce language and digitize it, participate in data creation. Limited languages mills the entire spectrum of structures of meaning and grammar and reasoning. So when queried in underrepresented languages, they produce fluent but borrowed logic system outputs. So they present technical challenges that need to be addressed. And then Boschny initiative is trying to address this by developing open language data sets under BRIM. Africa's Mekane is doing to do that through community-led NLP for African languages, which can be a good model for the global south. So inclusive data is not a just fairness imperative, it's a technical quality imperative as well. So non-representative data sets lead to compensatory model behavior, which is a lower efficacy reduced adoption, or linguistic inclusion and representation. AI is not just a technical issue, it's also a problem of equity and access, but at the same time, when inclusion and representation AI is not balanced, it could result in reduced adoption and then not well-developed, well-equipable, well-usable AI models. So the data center expansion we will see in greater detail in one of the upcoming sessions. Compute strategy, again leverage over sovereignty, this also we have seen in the key details. We have also talked about Pax Silica, we have also talked about the Silicon India mission and other things. So this is the phased roadmap, near-term operationalized AI mission, phase 2 DPDP Act, subordinate legislation for data categorization, incentivized value retention, medium-term selective scaling, formalized risk-based proportionate AI regulation, which can happen in the medium term, graduated under scale and sector, long-term resilience, strategic partnership, sustained labor market education adoption, foundational cognitive skills prioritized in primary education. So we are also referring to the National NEJD report as well as the NBGR perspectives. The ASTA study authored by ASTA just suggests that should combine legal frameworks, institutional mechanism. It also talked about the AI 6 pillars, whereas the Anulekha Nandi of ORF suggested that it combines deliberative reactive policies, and then the key overlapped gaps were professionalization of AI governance space, need rationalization for AI, technical governance approaches need standardized methods, audit and defined auditor liability. So these authors and others have suggested interministerial coordination committees plus technical secretariat plus multidimensional risk undertaking plus governance mechanisms that engender trust to enable downstream adoption. So the India's AI competitive advantages, which we have seen in earlier also, skill penetration is huge, diversity of domestic data is a great asset. India is a late mover, but still it is not locked into energy intensive infrastructure or ballooning financial commitments. India can design more resource efficient structures. So India's strength in applicable led innovation, productive use of domestic data, human capital depth, and ability for public institutions to coordinate distributed efforts, again building upon DPI for a template of AI OS. Conclusion, this opportunity is strategic and conditional. So challenge here is India operates under a heightened global uncertainty and resource constraint. Passive consumption is a riskiest position. Control over AI data input is required, but whereas it is globally concentrated, India must act before path dependence set in. So a bottom-up strategy anchored in open interoperable systems is also suggested. Going for sector-specific small models, shared physical infrastructure, governance, data governance, safety must evolve in parallel with deployment. So a view is choices made in the coming few years will determine whether AI deepens structural divides or becomes a tool for broad-based productivity and dignified work in India. India's task is to ensure the latter, and then how to go about it is the major challenge for India. So this is a list of suggested literature which we have used for this presentation. At the same time, as we said in the beginning, this is only a portion or a small portion of the available literature, and then we need to develop a session, come up with some overview of the available literature so that students and then learners will understand what the literature is talking about and then what is the state of the review in the literature. So take this as a guiding one, but not as the up-to-date or the more broad survey, in-depth survey of the available literature, but as the literature evolves, as the literature gets into taking into account the most recent data and available information, we need to update our understanding. We also need to keep ourselves abreast of the recent developments post, particularly in the policy and regulatory affairs, as well as in the global direction in which the AI sector is moving. Thank you.